When I first saw the lake, it didn't look like much. To most people, it was just a swampy patch of water choked with weeds, littered with years of garbage, and surrounded by collapsing docks that had long since given up the fight against time. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and silence hung over the place like a forgotten grave. But to me, it was more than that. I didn't just see mud, weeds, and broken boards. I saw potential. I saw history. And I saw a chance to bring something back to life. The old maps called it Willow Bend Lake. In its prime, decades ago, families came here to fish, swim, and picnic along the shore. It was the pride of the town, a small but shining oasis where water sparkled and laughter carried over the breeze. But then the land changed hands, developers came and went, and slowly the lake was abandoned. Without maintenance, the water stagnated, weeds took over, and soon even the locals stopped calling it a lake. To them, it was just a marshy liability. That was when I stepped in. I'd been searching for a property project, not just any project, but something lasting. Something bigger than myself. When I found that lake listed for sale, buried in county property records, and practically ignored, it felt like fate. The price was low, almost suspiciously low, but the paperwork was clear. Deed boundaries, even water rights. Everything was intact. On paper, the lake was mine to restore if I chose to take on the challenge. And so I did. The first days were overwhelming. The shoreline was littered with rusting car parts, piles of tires, broken bottles, and even an old refrigerator half buried in the mud. Trees that once shaded families were now dead husks, their branches clawing at the sky. The water, dark and stagnant, barely reflected the light. If I were anyone else, I might have walked away right then. But I couldn't. I could almost hear echoes of the past in that place. Children laughing, fishermen hauling in their catch, couples drifting in rowboats as the sun dipped below the horizon. The lake had been loved once, and it deserved to be loved again. So I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. The first step was draining sections of the lake, a process that required more than just effort. It required permits. Water rights are a tricky business, and before a single pump touched the shoreline, I filed the paperwork with the county. I made sure every step was legal, every move documented. I knew that if I was going to rebuild this place, it had to be done right. With permits approved, I rented industrial pumps and watched as the water levels dropped slowly, exposing a hidden world beneath. What surfaced was equal parts heartbreaking and motivating. Layers of trash, rotting wood, and years of neglect piled high like scars. I brought in dumpsters. One by one, I hauled out the debris. Car tires, rusted bicycles, chunks of concrete, even a set of old shopping carts that had somehow found their way into the muck. Day after day, load after load, I cleared the lake bed until the shore began to take shape again. My body ached, my hands blistered, but with every piece of garbage removed, the lake started breathing again. Locals began to notice. Some would drive by slowly, watching me work. A few stopped to talk. Some offered encouragement. Good to see someone finally caring about that place. Others were skeptical. You'll never fix it. It's been dead for years. But I didn't mind. I wasn't doing it for applause. I was doing it for the lake and for the vision I carried in my mind. As weeks turned into months, I tackled the shoreline next. Erosion had eaten away sections of the bank, so I reinforced them with stone and fresh soil. I planted new trees, knowing they would take years to grow, but also knowing they would one day restore the shade and beauty that had once defined this place. I worked with conservation experts too. Together, we tested the water and treated it carefully, balancing oxygen levels and controlling invasive weeds. Slowly, the water cleared. For the first time in decades, it reflected the sky again. There's a special kind of satisfaction that comes from watching something dead come back to life. One morning, standing by the shore, I saw ripples break the surface, a sign that fish, once driven out, were returning. Birds followed soon after, their calls echoing through the trees. Nature was reclaiming its place, and I was only the caretaker helping it along. It wasn't easy. I poured more money into the project than I had planned. Heavy machinery, permits, labor, materials, they added up fast. But every time I thought about slowing down, I'd picture the end result. a lake restored, a sanctuary reborn. The day finally came when I could sit at the edge of the dock, rebuilt with fresh timber, and look out at clear, shimmering water. The lake that had once been written off as worthless was alive again. For the first time, I felt like I had truly created something lasting. What I didn't know then was that my greatest challenge wasn't the mud, the garbage, or the weeds. It wasn't the permits or the endless hours of labor. No, the real battle was about to begin. Because just as I was ready to enjoy the lake I had poured my heart into, a new set of faces appeared at the shoreline. Faces that didn't come with tools or encouragement. Faces that didn't belong to nature reclaiming its place. They came with clipboards, legal threats, and a sense of authority. The Homeowners Association. They claimed the lake wasn't mine. They claimed it was community property, and they demanded I hand it over. At that moment, staring at them across the water I had fought to restore, I realized restoring the lake had been the easy part. Defending it, that would be the real test. Restoring a lake isn't just about draining water and hauling out garbage. It's about persistence, patience, and knowing when to lean on expertise. After those first exhausting weeks of clearing debris, I realized this project would demand far more than just muscle. It would require a balance of sweat and science, and sometimes both at the same time. Every morning, I woke before sunrise, drove down to the lake, and laced up my boots knowing that the day ahead would test me. The mud was thick, the work repetitive, and the cost seemed endless. But every step felt like progress. One tire gone, one broken bore hauled out, one section of bank stabilized. Piece by piece, the lake was coming back. But it wasn't just about cleaning. It was about doing things properly. Early on, I learned that lakes are legally complicated. In some states, owning the shoreline doesn't always mean owning the water. Water rights, riparian laws, and easements can create gray areas that outsiders love to exploit. I wasn't about to let my project get tangled up in bureaucracy later, so I took no shortcuts. I hired a surveyor to mark the exact property lines. With GPS precision, he confirmed what the deed already stated. The lake, its bed, and its shoreline were entirely mine. I filed copies with the county clerk's office, ensuring no dispute could erase the boundaries. Next came water rights. I consulted with state officials to make sure every gallon I pumped out, treated, and refilled was accounted for. I applied for restoration permits, ecological clearances, and even fishery certifications. Some might have seen this as overkill, but I knew better. When you're restoring something valuable, documentation is just as important as labor. One protects your sweat, the other protects your rights. By midsummer, the lake bed had transformed from a dumping ground into something recognizable. With the garbage gone, I could finally begin reshaping it. I brought in an excavator to deepen sections where silt had piled up, creating healthy gradients for aquatic life. Watching the bucket dig into the earth, hauling out decades of neglect, was strangely satisfying. It was as if I was carving away history's mistakes to reveal something timeless beneath. But heavy machinery couldn't do everything. For the delicate work, reseeding grasses, planting saplings along the bank, repairing eroded channels, I relied on my own two hands. Some days I was knee-deep in mud, hammering in wooden stakes to hold erosion barriers. Other days, I was bent over in the sun, planting reeds and cattails, knowing it would one day filter the water naturally. I wasn't alone in all of this. Curious neighbors began stopping by more often. Some brought iced tea. Others offered to lend a hand. A retired fisherman from town told me stories of how he used to cast his line there as a boy. His memories became fuel for me, proof that the lake had once been alive and could be again. Still, not everyone was supportive. A few skeptics shook their heads, muttering about wasted effort. "That place is cursed," one man said. Another joked that I'd sunk money into a bottomless pit. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, smiled, and went back to work. Because I knew something they didn't. Progress isn't measured by opinion. It's measured by results. And results were finally showing. The first time I saw clear water return was unforgettable. After weeks of filtering, dredging, and balancing, the lake stopped looking like a swamp and started looking like a mirror. Blue skies reflected off the surface again. Ducks landed where before there had been only muck. The air smelled cleaner. It was as though the land itself was breathing a sigh of relief. With clarity restored, I rebuilt the dock. The old one was nothing but splintered boards nailed to rotting posts. I tore down plank by plank, then drove in new pilings and laid down fresh timber. It was more than just a platform over the water. It was a symbol, a place to sit, fish, or simply watch the sun sink into the lake. The dock represented the bridge between the lake's past and its future. But as proud as I was, I knew I wasn't done. Lakes are ecosystems, and ecosystems require balance. I worked with conservationists to reintroduce native plants, the kind that stabilize banks and prevent erosion naturally. We tested oxygen levels and adjusted water flows to prevent stagnation. Slowly, life began to return. I'll never forget the morning I spotted the first fish jump. It was a flash of silver breaking the surface, followed by ripples spreading outward. To anyone else, it was small. To me, it was monumental. Proof that the lake wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And nature followed quickly. Birds returned, their calls echoing across the water. Frogs croaked at night. Insects buzzed where there had once been only silence. The lake was no longer dead. It was alive again, and in many ways, so was I. But the truth is, this wasn't just about restoring land. It was about proving something. Too often we give up on places we think are lost, places written off as worthless. But worth is a matter of perspective. Where some saw a swamp, I saw a sanctuary. Where some saw trash, I saw potential. The work wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Every blister and bruise was matched by pride. Every setback, a broken pump, a collapsed bank, an unexpected expense, taught me patience and resilience. And through it all, the lake responded, almost as if it knew I wasn't giving up on it. By late summer, I had something extraordinary, a restored body of water where none had stood for decades. From the road, you could see the shimmer of blue through the trees. From the dock, you could feel the calm of the water. From the shoreline, you could hear life again. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought the fight was behind me. But restoration wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because just as I was preparing to enjoy the lake, to finally sit back and let the water speak for itself, new voices began to appear. Voices that didn't sound like encouragement. Voices that didn't belong to conservationists, neighbors, or friends. These voices spoke in the language of control, of rules, of ownership. They belonged to the Homeowners Association, and they were about to claim that everything I had built, everything I had restored, wasn't mine at all. It was early autumn when I first saw them. I was standing on the dock, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise shimmer across the lake. For once, there was peace. The months of backbreaking labor were finally behind me. The lake was alive again, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could simply enjoy it. That's when I noticed a group approaching from the subdivision that bordered part of my property. They weren't curious neighbors coming to congratulate me. These people walked with a different kind of posture, stiff, self-important, and oddly rehearsed. At the front was a woman I would come to know very well, the president of the local homeowners association. Her name? Curran. I'd later learn her full title was HOA board president of Willow Bend Estates. But that day, she introduced herself with nothing more than a clipped smile and a clipboard tucked under her arm. Behind her, 2 board members flanked her like deputies on a mission. "Good morning," she said, with the kind of politeness that felt more like a warning. "We're here to discuss the lake." I looked at them, then back at the water. "The lake? My lake." Karen's smile thinned. "Well, actually, no. It's community property, part of the shared amenities of Willow Bend Estates. We need to talk about transferring access and management back to the HOA." I nearly laughed, not out of disrespect, but out of disbelief. After months of labor, tens of thousands of dollars, and legal permits stacked in my office, this woman was standing on my dock telling me the lake wasn't mine. I set down my coffee and calmly asked, "Do you have proof of that?" Her eyes narrowed. She flipped through the clipboard, showing me a photocopy of a subdivision map. A dotted line ran near the edge of my property, vague enough that, to the untrained eye, it looked like the water might be included. "This," she said, tapping the paper. "Clearly shows the lake belongs to the homeowners association. It's for the use of our residents. You can't just take it." I dealt with hard work, exhaustion, and setbacks during this project. But this was different. This was an attempt to erase everything with the stroke of a pen. So I smiled, went inside my cabin, and returned with my own stack of papers. "Here's my deed," I said, handing it over. "Here are my water rights, signed by the county. Here are the permits for drainage, dredging, and restoration. Every page is stamped and verified. And every one of them lists me as the sole owner of this property, lake included." Karen didn't take the papers. She just stared at me, as if I'd spoken a language she didn't understand. One of the board members muttered, "This has to be a mistake. We've always considered the lake part of the subdivision." "Considered," I replied, "doesn't mean owned." That was the end of our first confrontation, but not the end of the fight. Over the following weeks, letters began arriving in my mailbox, each stamped with the HOA logo. The first was almost polite, phrased as a request for me to hand over lake management. The second was less friendly, warning me that I was violating community standards. The third accused me of restricting resident access and threatened fines. Fines on land I legally owned. At first, I ignored them. After all, what power does an HOA have over property it doesn't control? But I quickly realized their strategy wasn't about truth. It was about pressure. If they could bury me under enough paperwork, enough intimidation, maybe I'd cave. Maybe I'd walk away. They didn't know me very well. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every notice. Every conversation was scanned, logged, and stored. I knew that if this ever escalated, evidence would be my strongest weapon. And escalate it did. One afternoon, I came home to find a notice taped to my cabin door. It claimed I was trespassing on my own land. The HOA had filed a complaint, insisting the lake was theirs and that my presence there was illegal. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just harassment. It was war. The thing about HOAs is that they thrive on authority. They write rules, enforce covenants, and collect dues. Within their boundaries, they can seem untouchable, but that authority has limits. It doesn't extend past what they legally own. And this lake? It wasn't in their boundaries, no matter how much they wished it was. So I doubled down. I reached out to the county recorder's office, pulling every map, survey, and historical record tied to the property. They all told the same story. The lake had never belonged to the subdivision. It was always separate, always private. Somehow, over time, the HOA had simply assumed it was theirs because no one had challenged them. Until now, when the HOA sent another final notice threatening to gate off access, I made a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the HOA, but to the county sheriff. When the deputy arrived, I handed him the same stack of documents I'd shown Karen. He read through them carefully, nodding as he flipped each page. Then he looked at me and said 5 words I'll never forget. "You're in the clear here." The sheriff drove down to the HOA president's house that same afternoon. I don't know what was said behind closed doors, but I do know this. The letters stopped coming for a while. But Karen wasn't finished. She came back, standing on the edge of the dock like she owned the place, her eyes full of quiet fury. "You don't understand," she said. "This lake is part of our community. People expect it. They pay dues for it. You can't just keep it." I held up the deed again. "Karen, you can't rewrite history. You can't erase ownership. This lake was abandoned, forgotten, and I brought it back. It's mine. And no amount of letters, threats, or false claims will change that." She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away. But I knew what that silence meant. The HOA wasn't backing down. If anything, they were just getting started. By the time winter rolled in, the HOA's quiet hostility had turned into a full campaign. They weren't just sending letters anymore. They were mobilizing their board, weaponizing bylaws, and rallying subdivision residents to believe a lie. That the lake I had restored, the lake I had bought, wasn't mine. It began with flyers. Neatly printed sheets slipped into mailboxes across Willow Bend Estates, claiming I had illegally seized community property. The wording was careful, vague enough to avoid outright libel, but strong enough to spark outrage. Suddenly, Neighbors I'd waved were giving me suspicious looks. Some stopped speaking altogether. Then came the fines. One envelope arrived after another, each demanding hundreds of dollars for violations of community standards. According to the HOA, I was guilty of restricting public access, failing to maintain common grounds, and my favorite, unauthorized construction. They were referring to the dock I had rebuilt with my own money on my own property. To anyone unfamiliar with HOA tactics, this might have seemed terrifying. The idea of mounting fines, legal threats, and community pressure is designed to wear a person down. But I knew better. I knew that none of these fines had teeth, because the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. Still, I didn't ignore them. Instead, I gathered everything into a binder: letters, flyers, fines, even copies of angry emails forwarded by sympathetic neighbors. I labeled each entry with the date, time, and source. If they wanted a war of paperwork, I was going to fight on my terms, organized, documented, and unshakably calm. But harassment has a way of escalating. One evening, I returned to the lake to find a chain stretched across the narrow gravel road leading to my property. Attached was a sign: private HOA property, no trespassing. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the audacity. They had blocked my own access road. The chain didn't last long. I cut it down and placed it neatly at the edge of the subdivision's entrance, along with a note of my own. This road and the lake beyond it are private property. Further attempts to obstruct will be treated as trespassing. I signed it, stapled a copy of my deed to the back, and walked away. That was the night I realized this wasn't just about power for the HOA. It was about image. The lake, now restored and beautiful, had become a jewel. Residents wanted it. The HOA wanted to claim credit for it, and I was standing in their way. So they escalated again. The next move came in the form of a formal complaint. The HOA filed with the county, accusing me of environmental violations, illegal drainage, unauthorized dredging, and destruction of wetlands. It was a clever move. If they could convince regulators I had broken the law, they could force the lake back into dispute. Fortunately, I had been meticulous from the start. Every permit, every survey, every authorization was in my files. When county inspectors arrived, I welcomed them. I walked them through the restoration, showed them the permits, and handed them copies of everything. By the end of the inspection, one of the officials shook my hand. "You did it right," he said. "Textbook restoration. They don't have a leg to stand on." When the HOA learned the county had cleared me, their frustration boiled over. That's when Karen made her boldest move yet. On a cold morning, just after New Year's, I was walking the shoreline when I spotted a group of residents gathered at the far end of the lake. At first, I thought it was just neighbors enjoying the view. But as I got closer, I realized they were carrying signs. "Our lake, our rights. Stop the land grab. Community property, not private profit." It was a protest, organized, loud, and aimed squarely at me. Karen was at the center, megaphone in hand, declaring to anyone who would listen that I was a thief. She told residents I had tricked the county into handing me the lake, that I was hoarding resources that belonged to families, that I was destroying the community spirit of Willow Bend Estates. It would have been almost laughable if not for the anger in the crowd. For the first time, I felt the weight of isolation. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was social. Neighbors were being turned against me. The HOA wasn't just trying to steal a lake. They were trying to destroy my reputation. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I did what I'd been preparing for all along. I called the sheriff. When deputies arrived, I walked them through the situation. I handed them my binder, thick with months of evidence. Deeds, permits, inspection reports, letters, notices, everything carefully logged and verified. The deputies listened, reviewed the documents, and then walked over to Karen. I couldn't hear every word, but I saw the shift in her posture. The fire in her expression dimmed. The crowd around her, once loud and confident, grew uneasy as the sheriff's tone hardened. Finally, the deputies turned and addressed the group. "The lake," one announced, holding up my deed, "is private property, legally owned, properly restored, and fully documented. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." Any further attempts to obstruct, threaten, or trespass would be treated as criminal offenses. Silence fell over the crowd. Karen tried to argue, waving her papers, but the sheriff cut her off. "Ma'am, unless you have a deed signed by the county, this conversation is over." And just like that, the protest dissolved. People drifted away, some embarrassed, others muttering about being misled. Karen stood frozen, humiliated in front of the very residents she'd tried to rally. For the first time since this battle began, I felt the tide turn. The showdown didn't end in one dramatic clash. It ended in pieces, the protests falling apart, the fines quietly disappearing, the flyers no longer appearing in mailboxes. Bit by bit, the HOA retreated, but not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. Truth and law had backed me. Evidence and preparation had protected me, and the sheriff's authority had driven the final nail into their claims. When the dust settled, I stood once more at the dock, looking out over the water. Calm, quiet, beautiful. The HOA had tried to rewrite ownership. They had tried to intimidate, threaten, and manipulate. But in the end, the lake remained what it had always been, mine. And the battle, for all its noise, had proven one thing beyond doubt. No amount of fiction, no amount of pressure, could change the truth written in black ink on a deed. The showdown with the HOA had ended. Their claims of community property dissolved the moment the sheriff stood at my side, confirming the truth. The deed, the water rights, the restoration permits, every legal strand tied the lake to me and me alone. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Months of sweat and labor, followed by weeks of harassment and intimidation, had come down to a single line in the sheriff's voice. This lake belongs to him. But when the dust settled, the story didn't simply vanish. What happened next would reshape not just my relationship with the lake, but my understanding of property rights, power, and community. At first, the HOA tried to retreat quietly. They had come marching in with clipboards, legal threats, and false authority. But after being confronted with the facts, they slipped back into their subdivision, suddenly quieter than before. Yet, in the neighborhood grapevine, the whispers began. Some homeowners admitted they'd been misled. The board had convinced them the lake was theirs by right of community use. Others confessed they never believed the HOA in the first place, but had been too afraid to speak up. That silence, broken only after confrontation, was one of the clearest lessons I learned. HOAs thrive on intimidation, on convincing people that they hold more power than they do. When challenged with evidence and law, their foundation often crumbles. I continued to work on the lake, but now with an extra sense of vigilance. Every letter, every notice, every encounter with the HOA, I documented it. Not out of fear, but out of caution. Paper trails don't lie. The sheriff, too, checked in a few times. Off duty, he told me stories of other property owners facing similar disputes. Cases where HOAs overstepped, tried to seize what wasn't theirs, or bullied families into submission. My fight, he said, was more common than I realized. And as the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. People started to visit. Local families asked if they could walk the shore, fish off the dock, or simply sit by the water. Unlike the HOA's demand, these requests were humble, human, and where it made sense, I said yes. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had tried to seize the lake under the false flag of community property. But the real community, neighbors, locals, children looking to cast their first line into the water, were the ones I actually wanted to share it with. Not because I was forced, but because I chose to. Ownership, when respected, has room for generosity. One evening, I sat on the dock watching the sunset ripple across the water. The lake was quiet, calm, and whole again. And I realized something. This wasn't just about property lines or permits. This was about dignity. About the right to restore, protect, and enjoy something without being bullied into surrender. The HOA had underestimated what this lake meant to me. To them, it was leverage, a bargaining chip, maybe even a revenue stream if they could claim it as theirs. To me, it was a promise fulfilled, months of hard labor, vision, and faith made real. And no piece of paper from an HOA binder could erase that. As word of the dispute spread beyond the subdivision, Local media picked up the story. Headlines carried phrases like HOA overreach blocked by deed holder and private land restored despite HOA claims. Some outlets framed it as a cautionary tale, a reminder to know your rights, keep your documents, and never assume an HOA's word is law. Others called it a small victory for property owners everywhere. For me, it was simpler. It was proof that truth, backed by patience and paperwork, could stand up to bluster. Months later, the HOA president, once so bold, resigned under pressure. Homeowners had grown tired of the legal fees, the embarrassing headlines, and the sour taste left by the lake incident. A new board was elected, one more concerned with fixing fences and mowing medians than seizing land that didn't belong to them. The lake, meanwhile, entered its next chapter. The water cleared further. Fish multiplied. Birds nested along the banks. It became what I had dreamed of all along, a living, breathing place no longer forgotten. Looking back, I see the conflict not as an interruption, but as a test. The lake was always meant to be restored, but the fight ensured that it would also be defended. And that lesson, the strength to stand firm against pressure, the value of doing things right from the start, stays with me every time I walk the shoreline. Because ownership isn't just a line on a deed. It's stewardship, responsibility, the willingness to protect what you've built, not only from nature's decay, but from people who would try to claim it without effort or right. Today, when I sit at the edge of the dock and watch the water ripple out toward the horizon, I don't just see a lake. I see proof. Proof that the sweat and hours mattered. Proof that the law, when respected, is stronger than any board's intimidation. Proof that peace is earned, sometimes only after standing your ground. The HOA came with claims, with demands, with their version of authority. And yet, when all was said and done, the truth was simple, undeniable, and unshakable. This lake is mine, and no HOA fiction can ever change that.